Okay, so what we want to do in this video is begin our study of what's called market equilibrium. And basically what we are doing is putting together demand and supply, the two separate ideas that we've already studied, putting together demand and supply onto the one diagram and seeing, well, essentially what happens. Now, basically what happens is the intersection of demand and supply. Now, please try to keep this in mind. Yes, we're going to be drawing this on a graph, but what are these graphs or these demand and supply curves representing? Well, they're representing the actions, the desires, the income changes, the input costs, the technology changes of people. Right? People own companies. Okay, you can't tax a company, you tax a person that owns the company. All right, and then people who are consumers, they're the supply that I just talked about, the people that own the companies, and then the consumers represent the demand, and they are making decisions that try to maximize their utility. All right, so firms tend to try to maximize profits, consumers tend to maximize utility. Now, when we actually get those two together, what actually happens is that in a market, demand and supply together determine prices and the equilibrium quantity that is produced and bought. Now, we will also have to have a quick look and introduction into the idea of competitive markets. We talked about this at the start of demand, but what competitive markets actually are is a very, very specific thing in economics. And right now, we're not going to go into great detail, but we will go into much further detail later on in the course. Okay, so I will say all of this just so you can hear it as well as see it. Demand and supply interacting together in a competitive market, right? Realize that when we're talking about demand and supply, we're talking about what's called perfect competition. That determines prices. And prices, I cannot stress this enough, guys, prices in a market-based economy allocates the economy's scarce resources which have alternative uses. Prices essentially cause people to change, which is the demand side, change in which they buy of a certain good or service, or which is the supply side, change in which they produce of a good or service. And you need to allocate or direct or use the factors of production in order to produce these things. All right, so it is price that brings the market into equilibrium. Now, what we are still on is the first real world issue in microeconomics and of the course, which is how do consumers and producers make decisions in trying to meet their economic objectives. Now, we have already said that the economic objective of a consumer is, well, I mean, usually we'll relax this or we'll analyze this in later videos, is utility maximization. All right, and for a producer, it's profit maximization. So how do consumers and producers make decisions trying to meet their economic objectives? That's what we're talking about. So a definition, if we're going to talk about market equilibrium, we might as well know what we're talking about before we speak about it. And a market is where buyers and sellers come together to carry out economic transactions. As I have already said, buyers represent the demand in the market and suppliers represent supply. So therefore, what's demand? Represented by buyers, the willingness and ability of consumers, buyers, to purchase a quantity of a good or service at different prices, willingness and ability. And supply is the willingness and ability of producers to produce a quantity of a good or service at different prices. Don't forget that the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied both change following changes in prices or movements. Now, this is just a quick little intro. Whether you believe that this accurately reflects the world that you live in, unfortunately, currently is irrelevant. Okay, this is what we are talking about. We are creating a theoretical construct, and we are talking about assumptions that we hold to be true, whether they represent what you perceive to be true or not. And again, like everything in economics, you've heard me say this if you've been unfortunate enough to be watching these videos, is that I'll do more in greater detail later on. Right now, we're just trying to create a mental construct, a theoretical idea, and then through which or within which we can think and analyze how people would make decisions if this were true, and then we can examine different market types later on in the course. Okay, so economists use the term competitive market to describe a market, a collection of buyers and sellers where people meet to carry out exchange, right, in which there are so many buyers and so many sellers that each buyer and seller has a negligible, impact on the market price. Now, also, remember this, that each seller is selling the exact same goods. So think of something like oranges, and think you go to a market with loads and loads of people selling oranges. And basically what we're saying is that if I took an orange from each stall, let's say an outside stall market, and I placed them in front of you, you could not tell me, right, from which stall I bought each orange. Essentially, they're largely homogenous. They're largely the same. Now, one thing that, when I first started studying economics, I didn't really kind of get, absolutely, each seller, when you open your own company, each seller is more than capable of charging $1 million for an orange. They can say that no, unless you give me $1 million for an orange, you're not buying it from me. But because there are so many sellers, and in the example I just gave, they're in stalls beside each other, well, then they'll just go, okay, you're €1 million or dollars an orange. This person here is 6 oranges for $1. See you later, mate. I'm not going to buy from you. So they are constrained in terms of what consumers are willing and able to pay. And as such, I can guarantee you, with 99.99% certainty, there's always one, but nobody will pay $1 million for an orange currently, as the world exists right now. So each seller of the good has limited control over the price because other sellers are offering the exact same product at potentially much lower prices. So once consumers realize that there's lots and lots of options for the exact same good, this is competitive markets, right? And that they're so close to each other, well then what you tend to find is that there is a market price for oranges. Everybody starts to kind of charge the same. A seller has little reason to charge less than the going price because they're profit maximizing. And if you're selling all that you have at $1 an orange, for argument's sake, well then why would you lower it to 50 cents an orange? You wouldn't, all right? Because that would just reduce your profit. So therefore, a seller has little reason to charge less than the going price, and if he or she charges more than the going price, buyers will make their purchases elsewhere. Similarly, no single buyer of a good can influence the price of the good because each buyer purchases only a tiny, tiny fraction of the total amount purchased. So if there is, let's say, a situation when there is a company that buys all of the milk from local farmers in an area, well then you, as the company that's buying all of that milk, you can certainly influence price, because you say you can either sell it to me at the price that I'm saying or not sell anything at all. That's because you are buying such a large fraction of the total market output. But because in competitive markets that doesn't exist, so because in competitive markets what we actually have is each individual buyer, is buying 1/1,000,000th of 1%, you can't influence the price. So that's really important in competitive markets. You can't influence the market price as a buyer or as a seller. Now, this is another very important point that I really want to stress. As we're interested in analysing how markets work, we'll only be dealing with the market demand curve and the market supply curve. So what's market demand and what's market supply? Market demand is the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves for a product of all the consumers in a market, right? How much of that good would be purchased at every given price by every single buyer in that market added together. Whereas market supply is the total quantity of a good or service that all firms are willing and able to supply at different prices. Now, a market-based economy, surprise, surprise, I'm going to repeat myself, okay? It needs markets to answer the 3 basic questions. And why does it need markets? Because it needs markets to answer these questions, because within markets, prices are determined, guys. All right, so please keep that in mind. So prices determine what is to be produced in a market-based economy. Prices determine how it is to be produced in a market-based economy, and prices determine who gets it. All of that was done in a previous video. So if we have the market for coffee here, and I think the very first thing I am going to say, and I'm right, which is before we start, we have to realize that what we are doing when drawing diagrams in microeconomics, which is what we are in right now, is the microeconomics rule of 11. And again, I have to give a massive shout out to a very good friend and international colleague, Brad Cartwright, who was the one that put all this together for me, at least anyway, and now I'm lucky enough to be passing it on to you. Okay, so what we need is we need a title. That's one. We need the price on the axis, on this axis, the vertical axis. That's two. We need a currency amount. Doesn't have to be dollars, but unless it's stipulated as something else, usually dollars is not a bad one to go. That's three. We need the origin. That's four. We need the quantity on the horizontal axis. That's five. Units per time period. That's six. And 7. Now we're only up to 7 and I said 11, okay? So what we have here is the demand curve and we have the D1 here, okay? We have also the supply curve in the S1. Now, I'll start again. We have this equilibrium point, we have PEQ1 and QEQ1. We have the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So what do we have for the rule of 11? We have the title, the price, the currency, that's 3. Equilibrium price 1, that's 4. Keep it as PEQ, but always, guys, always give a number because these will change. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We have the origin, which is 5. We have the equilibrium quantity, which is 6. The quantity axis marked, which is 7. The units per time period, which is 8 and 9. The D1, which is 10, and the S1, which is 11. Right, microeconomics rule of 11 for drawing these diagrams. Now from the diagram, well, the previous slide, the market demand curve and market supply, not individuals, these are market demand curve and market supply curve. All right, so please, please, please understand that this is all sellers in the market of a particular single good. All right, and these are all the buyers in the market of the exact same particular single good. Why not? We've said coffee, we can go with oranges, something like that, okay? There is one point. This is known as the market's equilibrium. That's what that is. You do not need to have equilibrium or this arrow on your diagram, okay? Now, another thing is the price at the intersection is known as the equilibrium price. And the quantity is called the equilibrium quantity. So there is the equilibrium price and there is the equilibrium quantity. Now, definition of market equilibrium. Okay, forgive me, these are the definitions you're going to have to learn off. The point where the quantity of a product demanded is equal to the quantity of that product supplied. This creates what's called the market clearing price and quantity, where there is no excess demand or excess supply. Now we will come to those things in the next two videos, excess demand or excess supply. What's the definition of equilibrium price? The price that is set by the interaction between consumers and producers in markets where there are no surpluses or shortages and the market has cleared. All of this will make further sense in a later videos. Equilibrium quantity, the quantity both demanded and supplied that exists at the market price. And then a definition of equilibrium, I don't know why, but why not? I suppose we'll put this in here. A state of rest, self-perpetuating in the absence of any outside disturbance. So basically what we're saying here is that you need to know all of those definitions, but just keep in mind that prices coordinate economic activity, and as such prices are determined in markets. They answer the three questions and they bring about a desirable result, okay, without any external forces, what we will call later on externalities. At equilibrium, this is so important, guys. The quantity of a good that the buyers are willing and able to buy exactly matches the quantity that sellers are willing and able to sell, and that's right here. Now listen very carefully. Let's say you go to a restaurant, right, and you want a steak, so you order a steak, no problem. Now think about this. You are the demand for that steak is one, it's just you. What would it be a good use of the restaurant's resources and hence society's resources in general if they brought you out just one tiny little itty bitty piece of steak? Obviously not. The quantity supplied would have been less than the quantity demanded. That doesn't satisfy you as a human being in that case. Now, on the other hand, you could say, so therefore quantity demanded didn't equal quantity supplied. And you should straight away see that that's not desirable. On the other hand, you say, okay, how are you, chef? Nice to see you. I want to order a steak, please. And the chef brings you out 20. Well, that's also a waste of society's scarce resources, because it's a waste of the restaurant's resources, and restaurant is part of society, so it's a waste of society's scarce resources. Okay, and the reason is because you only wanted one, but 20 were supplied. The demand was one, but 20 was supplied. So what we want in a situation is that what you are willing and able to buy at a certain price is exactly matched by what the firms are willing and able to sell at that exact same price. And the reason is we want to match the expenditure on resources, the amount of a good we produce. It's all great, it's all fine, we want production to be high, but we want production to match the demand. And that's what we have in this scenario here. This price is known as the market clearing price because at this price, buyers have bought one stake, all they wish to buy, and sellers have sold one stake, all they wish to sell. We want them to be the same. We don't want any waste. Okay, that happens there. Guys, I hope this helped. Thank you so much for watching, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next video.